Garrett Winslow sat in his parked car with the engine off and the headlights dead. His breath fogged the windshield in slow, uneven clouds. Outside, the January cold had turned Denver into a city made of ice and silence. And there she was, Elena Vargas, his housekeeper, walking away from the mansion into the frozen dark, carrying 2 heavy canvas bags that pulled her shoulders down like anchors. No gloves, no scarf, just a thin coat and a battered silver thermos tucked under her arm. She had refused the company car again. 11 months straight. Every single night, the same walk, the same bags, the same direction. 40 minutes into a part of the city where the streetlights stopped working and the roads gave up their names. Tonight, Garrett followed her. And what he found at the end of that walk broke something inside him that money, grief, and loneliness had never been able to reach. If stories like these stay with you, subscribe now. More powerful stories are coming your way. 3 weeks earlier, the morning had started the way every morning started in the Winslow mansion, with silence so thick you could hear the heating vents breathing through the walls. 14,000 square feet of Italian marble, hand-stitched leather furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the front range, and not a single sound that felt alive. Garrett came down the staircase at 6:15, the same time he had been coming down since Rebecca died 3 years ago. His footsteps echoed against the stone like a man walking through a cathedral with no congregation. The kitchen smelled like espresso and fresh rosemary. Someone had already set his coffee on the counter, black, no sugar, beside a folded newspaper and a small glass of water with a lemon slice balanced on the rim. He didn't know who did this every morning. He had never asked. Elena was already in the dining room, moving a cloth across the mahogany table with a rhythm so quiet it barely disturbed the dust floating in the early light. She didn't look up when he passed. She never looked up. In 11 months of working in his home, Elena Vargas had perfected the art of being invisible. She entered rooms after he left them. She cleaned surfaces he had just touched as though erasing the evidence that anyone lived there at all. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then, her voice came out so low it sounded like it was apologizing for existing. Garrett had hired her through an agency. He didn't remember the interview. He didn't remember her last name until the accountant asked him to verify payroll. She was the woman who folded his towels, polished his late wife's picture frames, and vanished through the service door every evening at exactly 7:15. That was the full extent of what Garrett Winslow knew about the woman who moved through his life every single day. That evening, Margaret Ashford arrived for dinner in a black dress that smelled like department store perfume and cold ambition. She kissed Garrett on the cheek, a kiss that landed like a transaction, and sat down at the table without acknowledging the woman who had spent 40 minutes setting it. When the soup arrived a degree below Margaret's preference, she turned to Elena with a smile that had no warmth behind it. "Sweetheart, when I say hot, I mean hot, not whatever this is. Try again." Elena picked up the bowl without a word, walked back to the kitchen, and reheated it. Her face showed nothing. Later that night, after Margaret had left and the house had returned to its cathedral silence, Garrett's driver Doug Heller mentioned something while pulling the car into the garage. "Mr. Winslow, can I say something that's been on my mind?" Garrett nodded absently. "Elena, your housekeeper. She never takes the car home. Not once in 11 months. Every night she walks. Same direction. Same 2 bags. Even in the snow." Garrett looked at Doug for a moment, then looked away. Maybe she likes the walk. But something about the way Doug said it, same 2 bags, stayed with him longer than it should have. Elena waited until the last light on the second floor went dark. She always waited. It was a habit born not from fear but from something quieter. A respect for the boundary between her world and theirs that she had drawn inside herself long before anyone asked her to. The kitchen at 7 o'clock was a different place than the kitchen at noon. At noon it belonged to caterers, to Margaret's dietary demands, to the hum of appliances working overtime for meals that were half-eaten and half-forgotten. But at 7, when the house exhaled and the staff disappeared one by one through the side entrance, the kitchen belonged to Elena. And she moved through it the way a surgeon moves through an operating room, with purpose, precision, and zero wasted motion. She opened the refrigerator first. The top shelf held tomorrow's breakfast prep, untouchable. But the second shelf, that was where the day's casualties lived. A quarter tray of roasted chicken that Margaret had declared too dry after one bite. A container of butternut squash soup that the caterer had overportioned. 3 dinner rolls still wrapped in cloth, warm enough to save if she moved quickly. Half a salad with the dressing on the side. 2 portions of braised short ribs that Garrett hadn't touched because he'd eaten dinner at his desk again. Alone, staring at spreadsheets instead of food. Elena packed everything into reusable containers she kept in a canvas bag beneath the sink. She worked without sound. The containers slid into the first bag with the efficiency of someone who had done this 330 times, because that's exactly how many nights it had been. Then came the thermos. The battered silver thermos with the dented cap and the faded label that had been scratched off years ago. She filled it to the top with hot coffee, screwed the cap tight, and placed it in the bag beside the food. She pressed her palm against the side of the thermos for a moment, feeling the warmth travel through the metal into her skin. A small ritual, private one. Then she moved to the second bag. This one was heavier. She pulled it from behind the pantry door where she kept it hidden beneath a folded apron. Inside were things that had nothing to do with the Winslow kitchen. 2 wool blankets she had bought from a thrift store on Colfax Avenue. A pack of men's thermal socks still in the plastic. A knitted scarf she had finished during her lunch breaks over the past week. And 3 bottles of hand lotion because the cold cracked skin faster than anything else and nobody ever thought to donate hand lotion. She zipped both bags, pulled on her thin coat, and walked out through the service entrance without looking back. The cold hit her face like a wall made of glass. Her shoes crunched against the frozen gravel of the driveway. The security light clicked on, then off, as if the house itself had blinked and already forgotten she was there. Garrett told himself he wasn't following her. He told himself he was just driving in the same direction, that the route happened to overlap, that curiosity wasn't the same thing as suspicion. But when he turned off his headlights 2 blocks past the Cherry Hills gate and let his car crawl at 15 miles an hour behind a woman carrying 2 bags in the dark, he knew exactly what he was doing. He just didn't know why it mattered so much. Elena walked with her head down, not from defeat but from wind. The January gusts came off the mountains like they had a personal grudge against anyone foolish enough to be outside past 7. She leaned into it, adjusting the bags on her shoulders every few steps the way someone adjusts to a weight they've carried so long it's become part of their posture. She didn't look behind her. She didn't look at the houses she passed. She walked the way people walk when they know every crack in the sidewalk by memory. The first 15 minutes were familiar territory. Quiet suburban streets, porch lights glowing amber behind iron fences, the distant bark of a dog who had never known a cold night in its life. Garrett kept his distance. He felt ridiculous. A grown man, a man who negotiated $100 million deals across conference tables, creeping through his own neighborhood in a blacked-out sedan like a character in a detective novel he would never read. Then the streets changed. It happened gradually. The way night falls, you don't notice the darkness until you're already inside it. The iron fences gave way to chain link. The porch lights gave way to nothing. The sidewalks cracked, then crumbled, then disappeared into gravel shoulders that crunched under Elena's shoes like broken teeth. Garrett had lived in Denver for 22 years. He had driven past these neighborhoods on the highway 1,000 times, sealed inside climate-controlled steel at 70 miles an hour, close enough to see the rooftops but never close enough to smell what poverty smells like when the temperature drops below 20 degrees. Tonight he smelled it. Damp insulation, rust, the chemical sweetness of kerosene heaters running in spaces that weren't meant to be heated. He parked the car at the edge of a road that didn't have a street sign anymore and continued on foot. The cold bit through his cashmere coat like it wasn't there. Elena turned left past a boarded-up laundromat, then right through a gap in a fence that had been cut open so many times the wire had curled back permanently, like a door that had given up pretending to be locked. Beyond the fence, Garrett saw it. A cluster of trailers arranged in a broken semicircle on a lot that the city had condemned 2 years ago. No lights, no running water, no reason for anyone to be there. But Elena walked toward them the way a woman walks toward home. She stepped over a frozen puddle, shifted the bags one last time, and pushed aside a blue tarp that hung where a door should have been. She disappeared inside. And from where Garrett stood, hidden behind a rusted dumpster with his hands shaking and his breath coming out in white clouds that dissolved into nothing, he heard something that stopped him cold. A voice. Old, fragile, warm. "Elena." "Mija. We waited for you." Garrett pressed his back against the dumpster and held his breath. The metal was so cold it burned through his coat. He didn't move. He didn't think. He just listened. Through the tarp, through the thin walls of that trailer that had no business sheltering anyone. Sounds reached him that he hadn't heard in years. The clink of mismatched plates being set down on a surface. The careful pouring of liquid from a thermos. A low hum. Someone humming a melody that wandered without finding a chorus. The way old people hum when they've forgotten the words but not the feeling. And Elena's voice, steady and soft, calling names like she was reading attendance at a school where everyone had already graduated from life's cruelest lessons. "Walter, yours is the short ribs tonight. Extra broth, the way you like it. Dorothy, I brought the squash soup. Still hot, I promise. Be careful with the lid. Frank, the chicken is the good one from today, not the dry one from Tuesday. Alma, here, dinner roll with butter, I saved 2 for you. Benny, come closer, don't sit by the wall, the draft comes through that crack. And Pearl, where's your blanket from last night?" 6 people. 6 elderly people sitting inside a condemned trailer on the outskirts of Denver in January, waiting for a housekeeper to bring them dinner made from a billionaire's leftovers. Garrett moved. He didn't decide to move. His body simply refused to stay hidden any longer. He crept along the side of the trailer until he found a window. The glass was gone. A sheet of plastic had been stapled over the frame, but one corner had peeled back just enough to see through. He pressed his face close and looked inside. The trailer was smaller than his walk-in closet. A camping stove sat on an overturned milk crate in the center, its blue flame the only source of heat in the entire space. Elena was on her knees, spooning food onto plates she must have brought herself. Ceramic plates, not paper, not plastic, actual plates, as if the act of eating deserved that much dignity even here. The 6 people sat in a rough circle around her on folding chairs and stacked pallets. Their faces were carved by weather and time. Their hands shook when they reached for the food, but they were smiling. A woman Elena had called Dorothy held her soup bowl with both hands and closed her eyes as the steam rose into her face. She breathed it in the way someone breathes in a memory. "This one tastes like my kitchen used to," she whispered, "before everything went sideways." Elena touched Dorothy's shoulder. "That's because I added the nutmeg tonight. You told me your mother used nutmeg." Dorothy opened her eyes. They were wet. "You remembered that." "I remember everything you tell me, Dorothy." Garrett's hand was gripping the trailer wall so hard that a piece of rotten siding crumbled in his fingers. He didn't notice. He was watching Elena unpack the second bag now, the heavy one. She pulled out the wool blankets, the thermal socks, the knitted scarf. She handed each item to a specific person, not randomly, not as a pile of donations tossed into a room, but chosen. Each thing had been bought for someone. Each thing had a name attached to it before it left the store. And that's when the cold got worse. The temperature had dropped again. Garrett could feel it in his teeth, in the bones behind his ears, in the way his lungs resisted every breath like the air itself had turned into something solid. But inside that trailer, the cold was doing something worse. It was choosing its victim. Walter sat closest to the gap where the tarp met the wall. He was the oldest of the 6. Garrett could see that even from outside. His frame was thin, folded in on itself like a letter that had been read too many times. He wore a flannel shirt buttoned to the neck and a pair of jeans that hung loose around legs that had stopped filling them out years ago. He was shivering. Not the ordinary kind of shivering that passes when you rub your hands together. This was the deep kind. The kind that starts somewhere below the muscles and works its way outward until the whole body vibrates like a tuning fork struck against stone. Elena saw it before anyone else did. She stopped unpacking. She looked at Walter the way a daughter looks at a father she's already losing. Then she looked down at her own coat. It wasn't a good coat. It was a brown cotton jacket with a broken zipper that she held closed with a safety pin near the collar. The lining was thin. One pocket had a hole in it that she'd stitched shut with black thread that didn't match. It was the kind of coat that a woman buys when she has exactly enough money to buy one coat and not $1 more. It was her only coat. She took it off. She didn't hesitate. She didn't make a speech. She didn't sigh or look toward the ceiling for permission. She simply stood up, walked over to Walter, and draped the coat around his shoulders the way you tuck a blanket around a child who fell asleep on the couch. Her hands smoothed the fabric over his arms. She buttoned the one button that still worked. Walter looked up at her with eyes so full of something that Garrett had to turn away for a second because it felt too private to witness. "Elena, you'll freeze, girl." "I'll walk fast, Walter. The walking keeps me warm." She said it the way she said everything. Quietly, without drama, without asking anyone to notice what she had just done. Then she sat back down in her thin sweater, crossed her arms against her chest, and started telling them a story about a dog she had seen that morning outside a bakery who had stolen an entire baguette and run down the street with it like a sword. The trailer filled with laughter. 6 old voices laughing in a condemned box on a frozen lot while a woman with no coat pretended she wasn't cold. Garrett slid down the side of the dumpster until he was sitting on the frozen ground. He pressed his hand over his mouth. He didn't make a sound. The tears came anyway, hot against his frozen face, falling into the collar of a cashmere coat that cost more than Elena earned in a month. If this story is touching something real inside you, hit that like button. It helps more people find stories that truly matter. He didn't remember driving home. The streets passed like slides in a projector stuck on automatic. Light, dark, and then he was sitting in his own driveway with the engine running and his hands still gripping the steering wheel, as if letting go would mean admitting that what he had just seen was real. The mansion greeted him the way it always did. The porch lights came on by sensor. The front door unlocked with a fingerprint he didn't feel. The foyer smelled like heated marble and the lavender diffuser that Margaret had installed because she read somewhere that lavender reduced cortisol levels. Garrett stood in the center of his living room and looked at it, truly looked at it, for the first time in years. A couch that cost $11,000. A fireplace that burned gas logs designed to look like real wood because real wood was too messy. A painting above the mantel that an art dealer had called a conversation piece, though no conversation had ever happened beneath it. He walked to the kitchen. The lights hummed on automatically. Everything gleamed. The countertops reflected his face back at him like dark mirrors. He opened the refrigerator and stood there, letting the cold air spill over his shoes. The top shelf was full. Tomorrow's breakfast prep, smoked salmon, organic eggs, a fruit arrangement cut into shapes that no one had asked for. The second shelf was where Elena worked every night. He could see it now. The gaps. The spaces where containers had been, where leftovers had lived for a few hours before she packed them into canvas bags and carried them 40 minutes into the dark. He looked at the trash. A full bag, tied and ready for morning pickup. He opened it. Inside, a barely touched tray of catered croissants from Margaret's brunch 2 days ago. A container of pasta that had been ordered, delivered, opened, tasted once, and discarded. An entire roasted chicken carcass with meat still clinging to the bones. Enough food to fill every plate in that trailer twice. Garrett closed the trash bag. He sat down on the kitchen floor, the cold tile pressing through his pants, and pulled Elena's employee file from the counter where he'd left it weeks ago, and signed, because Margaret had requested her termination for attitude issues, and he hadn't gotten around to reviewing it. He opened it now. Elena Vargas, age 41, former certified home health aide, 12 years of experience caring for elderly patients. Certification revoked following a theft accusation from a client, Judith Davenport, Park Hill neighborhood. Investigation closed. No charges filed. No evidence recovered. A note at the bottom from the agency. Ms. Vargas did not contest the accusation. She stated, "The truth doesn't need me to defend it. It just needs time." Garrett read that line 3 times. Then he closed the file and pressed it against his chest the way a man holds something he should have read a long time ago. The house was silent. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. Felt guilty. The next morning arrived the way winter mornings do in Denver. Slow, pale, reluctant, as if the sun itself needed convincing to show up. Garrett came downstairs earlier than usual. He hadn't slept. The circles under his eyes were dark enough that even the bathroom mirror seemed concerned. He sat at the dining table with a cup of coffee he didn't drink and waited. Margaret arrived at 9. She let herself in with the key Garrett had given her 6 months ago, a key she used like a deed of ownership. Her heels announced her before her voice did sharp, deliberate clicks across the marble foyer that sounded less like walking and more like counting. She kissed Garrett on the forehead without looking at him, set her bag on the chair Elena had polished an hour earlier, and pulled out her phone. "Babe, I moved the engagement party to the 3rd. The venue on Larimer had a cancellation. I need you to confirm the guest list by Friday." She said it the way she said everything, as a statement that had already been decided and was merely being delivered. Garrett nodded. He wasn't listening. He was watching the doorway to the kitchen where Elena had just appeared carrying a tray of water glasses for the dining room. She moved with her usual silence, her eyes fixed on the tray, her steps measured to avoid every squeaky tile she had memorized months ago. Margaret noticed her the way a person notices a fly that lands on a table, with irritation that the world had failed to keep itself clean. "Elena." The name came out like a correction. "There's a watermark on the table. Right side. Near my chair. I noticed it when I sat down." Elena set the tray on the sideboard and walked to the table. She leaned close, examining the surface. There was nothing there. The mahogany was spotless, polished to the point where it reflected the chandelier above like a dark lake. But Elena didn't say that. She pulled the cloth from her apron and wiped the area in slow, careful circles. "No, not like that. You're going to scratch it. Use the other cloth, the microfiber one." "How many times do I have to explain this? Is it a language issue? Should I speak slower?" Elena stopped wiping. She straightened her back. She looked at Margaret. Not with anger, not with tears, not with the submissive downward glance that Margaret had grown accustomed to receiving from people she considered beneath her. She looked at her the way calm water looks at a stone thrown into it, absorbing the impact without breaking apart. "The table is clean, Ms. Ashford. It was clean before you arrived. But I'll wipe it again if that makes your morning easier." Margaret's jaw tightened. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room the way gas fills a closed space. Invisible, pressurized, waiting for a spark. Garrett watched from his chair. His coffee had gone cold. His hands were still. And somewhere behind his ribs, in a place he had stopped visiting after Rebecca died, something shifted. Not a thought, not a decision, something older than both. The quiet recognition that he had been sitting at tables his entire life while the wrong women wiped them. He found her in the kitchen that evening. 7 o'clock. The house was empty. Margaret had left after lunch with a goodbye that felt more like a receipt than a farewell. The caterers had gone. The silence had returned to its throne. And Elena was standing at the counter with her 2 canvas bags open, her hands deep inside the refrigerator, doing what she had done 330 times before. She heard him come in. Her hands stopped. She didn't turn around. She simply stood there, half bent toward the second shelf, holding a container of leftover soup in one hand and a truth she had been carrying for 11 months in the other. "I know where you go, Elena." The words landed on the kitchen tile like coins dropped from a great height, small, hard, impossible to ignore. Elena closed the refrigerator. She placed the container on the counter. She turned around slowly, the way a person turns when they've already decided that whatever comes next, they will face it standing up. "How long have you known?" "Since last night. I followed you." She nodded. No shock, no panic, just a slow exhale, like a woman setting down a suitcase she'd been carrying up an endless staircase. "Then you saw." "I saw everything." The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The lavender diffuser Margaret had installed released its quiet, expensive fragrance into a room that suddenly felt too small for what was being said inside it. "Are you going to fire me?" Garrett pulled out a chair from the kitchen island. He sat down. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he asked one of his own. "Why didn't you ever ask me for help? You've been inside my house for almost a year. You've seen what gets thrown away. You know what I have. One conversation, Elena. One sentence. That's all it would have taken. Elena looked at him. Her eyes were dry but full the way a river is full before it finds the crack in the dam that lets everything through. Mr. Winslow, I didn't take anything you wanted. I took what you were already throwing away. The food on your plates feeds this house for one meal. The food in your trash could feed 6 people who haven't had a warm dinner since the world decided they were finished. I didn't steal from you. I saved what you were wasting. And if that's a crime, then this world has its laws written upside down. She paused. Her hands were steady at her sides. Her voice never rose above the volume of a woman who knows that quiet words, spoken from a place of truth, hit harder than any shout. You want to know why I never asked? Because asking means explaining. And explaining means proving that 6 human beings who fought wars, raised families, paid taxes, and built lives in this country deserve to eat dinner. I shouldn't have to prove that, Mr. Winslow. Nobody should. Garrett didn't speak. He couldn't. The thermos I carry every night, she continued, her voice dropping even lower, as if what she was about to say was too sacred for normal volume. It belonged to a man named Walter Briggs. He was a home health aide. 20 years ago, he trained me. He taught me how to check a pulse, how to lift a patient without hurting their back, how to sit with someone who's dying and not be afraid. He gave me that thermos on my first day. He said, "The people we take care of don't need medicine half as much as they need someone who shows up." Walter showed up for 30 years. Then the system forgot him. And now he lives in a trailer with no door, wearing my coat, drinking coffee from the thermos he gave me when I was 21. She stopped. The kitchen was so quiet that Garrett could hear the ice cracking inside the freezer behind the steel door. I show up, Mr. Winslow. That's all I do. I show up. Garrett didn't offer Elena charity. He had learned enough about her in the last 24 hours to know that charity would have insulted her more than silence ever did. Instead, he offered her something she never expected: a seat at the table. Within 3 weeks, the condemned trailer park on the outskirts of Denver was purchased by the Winslow Development Group. Not for luxury condos. Not for commercial retail. Not for any of the things Garrett had spent 22 years building. The lot was cleared, redesigned, and rebuilt into a permanent housing facility for homeless seniors. 24 units, each with heating, running water, a kitchen, and a door that locked from the inside. Garrett named it the Walter Briggs Senior Center. He didn't ask permission. Elena was appointed director, not as a gift, not as a gesture, as the only person in the city who had spent 11 months proving she understood what those people needed before anyone with money even bothered to look. Margaret Ashford left the picture the way cold leaves a room when someone finally opens the curtains. Slowly at first, then all at once. She never received an explanation. She didn't need one. The engagement was canceled with a single phone call. Her key was returned in an envelope with no note inside. On the morning the center opened, Garrett stood in the parking lot watching Elena walk through the front entrance carrying the same 2 canvas bags. But this time the bags were lighter. This time the building had heat. This time there was a door instead of a tarp. And beside her, walking slowly with a cane and a flannel shirt buttoned to the neck, was Walter Briggs. His free hand held the battered silver thermos. Dented, scratched, with the label worn off years ago. Elena placed that thermos on the front reception desk. She filled it with fresh coffee. She left the cap off so the steam could rise where anyone walking in could smell it. The first thing a person would notice before they noticed anything else. Warmth. Someone had shown up. If this story reminded you that the people who serve in silence often carry the heaviest truth, share it with someone who needs to hear that today.